Thank you for having me. This is my only my second time talking to the Langford Hills Chapter of the Audubon Society, so it's nice to be here. And I am going to talk to you about some of the things that, for me, make it really special to be here as a birder, and why it's also really special to be here as an ornithologist who's interested in bird movements of all kinds. And also then to sort of talk to you a little bit about how we typically study movements and how some of those things are maybe not as ideal for studying movements as we want, and a little bit about a brand new sort of technology that's coming to this part of our world and what it will allow us to do. So I think most people in North America that I've run across, or certainly outside North America, sort of have this vision of Kansas. You know, it's a place that you get through quickly on the way to somewhere else, and they, you know, most of them witness it maybe this way along I-70, but others, you know, just sail over the top and have this impression that there's really not much there. That we're dealing with a place where, you know, it's not one of these, it's not the beach, it's not the mountains, it's not these places that seem to be on the surface of it super, super amazing and great to hang out. But when you get out of your car, you start to see up close and personal, start to walk in the grasslands, the prairies that are around us, and see just how amazing they are. And you start to see some things that maybe break those stereotypes. For one thing, it is definitely not flat. I have worked enough times in walked up from some very steep hills in the Kanza. Any of the undergrads who worked for me will definitely confirm that it's not flat out there. It's also definitely not all grass. These grasslands host a huge diversity of plants, insects, small mammals, and while it's not nearly as diverse as some other like biomes, like tropical forest or something, it's very rich, very complex, very interesting, and beautiful. One of the things that really strikes me about it is that they are constantly changing. We see these amazing changes even over the course of a day, incredible weather, and of course, really dramatic changes that occur across seasons. And no matter what season you're in, it's interesting and special at any time of year. Now, before I moved to Kansas, Robert, my husband here, and I were living in Vancouver, British Columbia. And, you know, it's one of these places with mountains where they think they have it all. And I remember getting my job and being really excited to share this amazing good news. Like, I finally got a faculty job, and people kind of were very lukewarm about it. It's like, oh, Kansas, huh? Okay, well, good luck. And, you know, it became clear that they just had no idea about what was there. And so their ignorance led to sort of indifference. And I have to admit that even though I did have a better idea than most, I also didn't really get it. I grew up at the northernmost extent of the tallgrass prairie in the city of Winnipeg, in southern Canada. And it's right where the tallgrass prairie ends and merges into boreal forest. And if you zoom in on the area around Winnipeg, you'll see that it's incredibly intensively cultivated. It's this very rich agricultural soil. It's the breadbasket of Canada, lots and lots of wheat and other grains and other products. And so my whole entire experience of prairie growing up was a couple of school trips to this tiny 1 by 1 mile square called the Living Prairie Museum, and it really was a museum. It was not a functional ecosystem at all. And so I have to say that moving here and seeing this was a revelation, because I knew from reading about it, I knew from a little bit of firsthand experience how amazing the prairies are here, but I really didn't get how incredible it is to leave town, to drive out into the country, and to mainly see unplowed native prairies. And so I've been teaching ornithology here, I've been researching birds here, and I've also been a birder. So I assume that many of you, if not all of you, are birders. And so one of the things, I'm going to share a few of the things that make it special for me to be here as a birder first. One thing is that we're at these really interesting range boundaries. So right here in Manhattan, right around Manhattan, we can get eastern meadowlarks and western meadowlarks, and we're right at where those ranges meet. We go a little bit one way or the other, you only get a single species. And there's a whole bunch of species pairs like that. We got Say's phoebes and eastern phoebes, western bluebirds, eastern bluebirds, spotted towhees, eastern towhees. At the subspecies level now, it's yellow-shafted and red-shafted flickers, and of course buntings, which are so beautiful that show up in the summer, lazuli and indigo buntings. And so those range boundaries of all those species pairs fall somewhere in Kansas, not necessarily right here, but it provides this tremendous richness and this change from the eastern to the western avifauna. We also are at this boundary between the north and the south. So we get black-capped chickadees blending into Carolina chickadees, not California, Carolina chickadees in the southern part of the state. And we see multiple other examples of that as well. So it's really exciting from the perspective of just seeing those transitions. And of course, some of the transitions that happen annually over the course of, over seasonal scales. So we are on a couple of major migration flyways. The sort of Mississippi waterfowl migration flyway that runs along sort of the east side of our state brings us these massive aggregations of, in this case, snow geese. This was taken at Jeffrey Energy Center a couple of years ago. Also, that sort of more deciduous forest on the eastern side of the state brings us these gorgeous, beautiful gems of warblers that we all look for in the spring. And then in the middle of the state, we have this incredible central flyway for waterfowl. So massive aggregations of cranes going through, and then, of course, shorebirds, which are the main reason why Quivira and Cheyenne Bottoms have been declared these globally important bird areas. Places that if they went away, huge, like the majority of populations of several species would be in deep trouble because they depend on that during migration. And then finally, I want to highlight some of the special winter visitors because some of my favorite birds around this time of year are ones that come to us from way far north, and definitely my favorite of those is Harris's sparrow, which we can find pretty commonly in brush piles and areas, especially a little bit outside of town, but even on K-State campus. And Harris's sparrows are so cool. I try and convince my students of this. I'm going to show you a map now. So this star here is where we are, and that line shows where they migrate to. They go to the very northern part of tundra, up on the Arctic plain, to breed. And they breed in a very narrow sort of longitudinal range too. So there's very, very few people up there. Very few people get up there to study them. They're quite unknown on their breeding areas, and we live in this relatively small area of their wintering distribution and have a unique opportunity to contribute to the knowledge of their biology because of where we are in the Great Plains. And there are others like that, American tree sparrows and juncos. These three are sort of our most common wintering sparrows in most part. So then finally, everybody thinks about these north-south migrations. We get some really interesting east-west migrations. People don't talk about them so much, but your very own prairie falcon gives its name to the publication. Does this really cool thing. Has anybody ever noticed this about their range, their distribution? So the purple area there and the little bit of orange that sticks up is their breeding area, and actually year-round. But they breed where it's purple, and then in the winter they sort of spread out across the Great Plains and into the prairies, and so they're really named for their wintering distribution, which is here. And we don't know nearly as much about those kinds of movements as we do about the more sort of traditional north-south movements that many of the well-studied migrants make. And so I think this rich diversity of movements makes it a great place to go out and go birding. I mean, for one thing, from January to when my class finishes in May, my students see, 90% turnover, different species from start to finish. No, maybe not 90, maybe 80, but a big turnover, and that's really cool for them. All those things contribute to why it's also a really good place to be if you're an ornithologist like me. So a lot of that range stuff, a lot of the migration patterns and our position there make it special, but there are a few other things that make being an ornithologist in Kansas special as well. So, as you know, we are right smack dab in the middle of the Great Plains grassland biome, and that's what this green area is here. It extends from southern Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all the way down to the northern central areas of Mexico, and encompasses this huge range in between. And we are right at the crossroads there. We also span a really interesting east-west gradient of rainfall, from wetter in the east side of the state, drier in the west, and that has huge implications for our bird communities. Of course, if you just think about tall grass prairie, another thing that's really special about where we are is the fact that all that pale area is the historic distribution of tall grass prairie in North America. And it was huge. Interestingly, sort of spread way east over to Lake Michigan, which is kind of cool. The vast majority of that is gone. And the dark green bits there are the bits of native tall grass prairie that still exist. And the only big area of tall grass prairie remaining in the whole of the world is right here in the Flint Hills. And if you also mentally overlay in your brain sort of human populations, cities, human population densities, you'll see in your mind's eye that where we are, where that prairie is also an area with relatively low population density. And of course that could be why we still have prairie, but it also means that there are very few people like me out there in a position to take advantage of that unique biological community that out our doorsteps. The people can study the prairie, of course, if they live elsewhere, but it's not nearly as easy, and it's not as easy to sort of incorporate it into your daily life and teaching and that sort of thing. So I feel pretty much a moral obligation, a duty really, to study the grassland birds that are here. And part of that duty is because we are losing them so much, so fast. This is an incredibly powerful graphic, I think, that was accompanying a paper that came out a couple of years ago by a very well-respected group of ornithologists in the country that documented how many birds we've lost. And they express this in terms of the proportion of species, but also in terms of the sheer numbers of individuals, which I think is really powerful. And they categorize those in different ways. And so this is a little, there are hardly any figures in here at all. This is the only figure I think I'm going to make you look at. So this one shows on the left, these bars show how much decline, percentage-wise decline in individuals from these different groups have been lost since 1970. And on the right, the little pie charts there are proportion of species. And by far and away, grassland birds are the group that we've lost the most of, okay? So we live in this threatened biome, there's not very many of us there, and they're tanking. Obviously, people like me and as many other people as possible have to try to do what we can to turn that around. I mean, it's not acceptable to lose our native avifauna. And so when we think about those grassland birds, we're mainly thinking about the birds that breed here. So these data are based on breeding bird survey data by and large. And so let's look at some of the movements of that group, because the ones I showed you before are the ones that winter here or come here during the non-breeding season. But the movements of those breeding birds are really fascinating as well. So I'll start with grasshopper sparrows, which are my, they're my favorite. It's okay, you can have favorites. They're my favorite grassland bird. I've been studying them since the first year that I got here. And I'm going to put a star now at Kansas still, and where they nest. They, like many of the other grassland sparrows in the Great Plains, migrate down to the Gulf Coast or Texas or northern Mexico, so the state of Coahuila, Chihuahua, and so they are relatively short distance migrants. They aren't quite such superstars as that Harris's sparrow that I showed you before. But that's not the whole story, right? Dick sissels, by far and away the most common species out on Kansa, they migrate, they just bypass all that, northern Mexico stuff. They bypass all the Central America, forget it, it's too wet, they don't like it. They go all the way to northern South America, and they spend their winters in areas that are pretty much similar to like the Everglades in Florida, if you've ever been there, seasonally flooded grasslands, and then increasingly places that are cultivated, especially for rice. And so they're actually an agricultural pest in the winter, which is, of course, a problem for them. Okay, so dick sissels are impressive, but wait till we get to upland sandpipers, okay? So I've had to tilt the globe here, so Kansas is way up on the edge there. They do this amazing thing. So they'll head straight south, head out across the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico, and cross Central America, go down cross over the Andes, spend some time on the east side of the Andes, cross back over, and end up wintering in the temperate zone in the south temperate area. They completely bypass all that nasty, wet tropical forest. They just forget that. They want to go to where it looks like ranchlands again, just like our native ranchlands, except in the southern hemisphere. Absolutely mind-boggling migrations. And the crazy thing is well, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but we're starting to get information that shows that they make relatively few stops along the way, that they're doing this in a few long-haul flights, and it's just crazy. So we know now, we've known for quite some time, more or less where birds go, okay? We have, you look at your guidebook and you see wintering ranges and summering ranges, and that's pretty accurate by and large. As a species. What we don't know, though, is very much about those movements at levels lower than the species. Where does a particular population spend the winter? And how do individuals do this? When you see an overlap in breeding and non-breeding, do some individuals just stay and some hopscotch, or all sorts of questions that we are starting to learn the answers to. Although we know a lot, we're still learning an awful lot about movement. And so I just wanted to share just a few of the things, I think 3 things that I, and especially my students, give a shout out to all the hardworking graduate students out there, have discovered about some of the movements of the birds right around here. So I'm going to start with grasshopper sparrows. And this is one of the most recent results, and why I'm really excited about it. Grasshopper sparrows at the Kansa Prairie. We've been studying, like I said, since 2013. And so we've built up quite a long record of individuals, what individuals do. We put these little color bands on their legs, and we know who each bird is, and we capture them, we map their territories, we see who comes back from year to year, we find their nests, which is really hard, and figure out how well their nests do and all that. And we've got enough data now over a long enough period to be able to ask, what determines that decision about whether or not these birds are going to come back? Because it turns out that, say there were 200 grasshopper sparrows at Kanza last summer who had territories. That's a reasonable estimate. Only about 20% of those individual males will come back this summer, or this spring and summer. And we don't think that 80% of them die. We're pretty sure that many of those that don't come back go somewhere else. And if you want to talk about that later, I'm happy to explain why we have quite a lot of evidence of that now. But they're clearly making decisions about whether to return to the same location to breed, which is what your average typical eastern deciduous migrant, a vireo or warbler or something would do. They nest in one place, and once they do that, they'd come back to sometimes the same tree. You might have individuals nesting in your backyard, and chances are it's the same individuals nesting year after year. But grasshopper sparrows are not like that. They, the majority of them will not come back to Kanza. They'll go somewhere else. They may eventually in a future year come back to Kanza, but not necessarily the next year. And so amazingly, we're interested in we've ruled out sort of like food shaping any of this stuff. It's incredible. But we're really interested in the consequence of this really variable rainfall that we get locally from year to year. And my PhD student, Katie Silver, one of the projects that she's been doing, she's related this probability of coming back to how rainy it was 2 years before, which is remarkable. We think it has to be shaped in some way by the vegetation. And because also she's related changes in vegetation structure to that same variable, how rainy it was 2 years ago. And we don't understand all the links there, but it's pretty clear that this climatic variation that we experience is influencing these decisions of birds a couple of years down the line, which is, I think, pretty amazing. Okay, I'm going to switch gears. You maybe saw the Henslow sparrow on my title slide, and we know something about how they move around too. Totally different methods. We didn't mark any of these birds, but we did different student markers. Just a crazy number of roadside surveys, kind of like the BDS, and figured out that these birds are moving also. They're characterized as nomadic, and that's because in one year you might find them really abundant in one place, another year you might find them really abundant in another place. And he figured out how they're choosing where to go, which attributes the landscape they most are attracted to, and how that changes with land management. So they really hate trees, like a lot of grassland birds. They really, really hate trees. And they really don't like to be near an edge. And so they like patches, big areas of interior habitat, far from a treed edge or a developed edge or a road, like a major road. And agriculture isn't so bad, it turns out, which is a good thing. But they're moving towards these areas of big interior habitat in places that were not burned the previous year. So they really like it if it's burned like every 2 or 3 years, and they'll come the year after that to those areas. Okay, so the third little tidbit I'm going to give you has to do with both grasshopper sparrows and Henslow sparrows. We know now not only move between years, but they move around a lot within years. And so I've shown you these little birds, and they've got little codes next to them. You might see this one on the left that says DOBS. That's dark blue over orange. That's its color bands on its left leg, and then blue over silver, light blue over silver on the right leg. And what we do is, we map these territories, and then we go back and look at, we do this, 12 or 13 or 14 times over the season. So roughly every week to 10 days, we go back and search for every single one of those birds that have been banded. And what we did the first year is we set out these plots, these little 10-hectare plots, and we banded all the birds. And by a month later, a huge proportion of those had moved out, had gone somewhere else, had been replaced by underbanded individuals, and we started to find the banded ones showing up in different parts of the prairie, sometimes several kilometers away. So they're setting up a territory, having a nest, which may or may not be successful, and then they can have multiple 2 or 3 nests in a season. They're going somewhere completely different to have their next nests. And so a lot of those movements aren't super big, but some of them probably are considerably bigger than we even know, because we kind of lack the ability to track them once they go outside of the Kanza. Hence, foreshadowing this stuff at the end of the talk. We do know that whether or not they move is related to whether or not they were successful in raising their young. We also know that if they move, they are then better at locating a good spot to put that nest. They reduce their nest predation rate, they reduce the amount that they get parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds, and it has nothing to do with food. Believe me, it's hard work to figure that out, but as far as we can tell, there's lots of food out there, so we aren't worried about that. Okay, so I've told you some of the things we do know. There's unfortunately, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, there's a lot we need to learn. The stuff we don't know is what keeps me going, right? It's really interesting and really intriguing, and I love that. And so how do we study these movements over big scales, over small scales? I'm going to go through some of the ways that ornithologists use to come up with the kinds of answers of the things that we know and that I've told you so far. One, not that old, but it's become incredibly useful to ornithologists around the globe, and especially in the Americas, is something that you all maybe have contributed to, eBird. Is there anybody here who does eBird? Mm-hmm. Maybe one person? Yeah, a couple people. Well, you don't have to, of course, but and a lot of birders think of it as a platform for curating their own observations, and that's why it's been so successful, is because it's really good for that. But also, it's really good for science. And so those observations are useful for people to figure out where birds go over the year. This is a dynamic map of upland sandpiper modeled abundance. It's not just the raw observations that you get from eBird, but they took that, they accounted for a lot of biases in where people are looking at birds and that sort of how detectable birds are and that sort of thing, and have estimated the relative proportions of birds over the course of the year. And I picked that same species because I think it's such an amazing migration route. So this is really great. And one of the things that's great about it is that it covers a very large geographic extent. A problem is that we don't get individual level data, like I was talking before. So it's really good for refining basically our range maps and knowing precisely when and where large numbers of individuals are going to be, but we don't learn about the individuals so much. So a very long-standing method that we've used in ornithology is bird banding. Have any of you ever been out banding? Okay, one person. Does anybody want to? Yeah? Okay. Well, I do a bird banding project, and I am going to be welcoming visitors to the site starting later this spring. So if any of you want to just come out for a morning and see what we do, talk to me later and I can make that happen. We capture birds, we put a little uniquely numbered ring on their legs, a little bit of bling, and we let them go. They go on their way, and hopefully they get captured again by somebody else somewhere else. And so that's amazing, because then we know 2 really precise times and locations that an actual individual has moved between. And we can, we can learn something about the age of the individual and maybe its body condition when we capture it both before and after and that sort of thing. The problem with banding is that we get very few returns of bands. There's a huge investment of time and effort, so it's very labor intensive, and we don't get very many of those bands back. And so, especially for some species like, I will say, grasshopper sparrows, unfortunately, we have very few recaptures between sites, which is the thing that we would like to be able to have, and it partly has to do with the sparseness of people studying them. Another way that we study movement, one that I've used quite a bit, and I forgot to animate this properly, so I'm just going to animate it all very quickly. Okay, is stable isotopes. And so these are biochemical signatures of place. They're not radioactive, they're heavy isotopes that are stable in the environment. And some of them vary predictably over geographic gradients. Like you can see across Kansas, we get sort of that gradation from sort of orange, yellow, green, and that has to do with rainfall. When a bird is molting, when it's growing its feathers, it's eating in the environment, and it's incorporating whatever local signature of the isotopes where it's molting into those feathers. But the nice thing about birds is that when they've finished molting, those feathers are then cut off from blood supply. And so they're inert, and that's why they have to be regrown, like new ones every year. But what that means is that if you catch a bird at a different time of year, and you can sample that feather, and you can relate it to the isotopes in different parts of the range, then you know where it molted. And so that's been really useful for me to understand. That's one of the ways that we know that our grasshopper sparrows are dispersing and not just dying. Because we capture them on a breeding season here at Kansa, and we can relate them to a sort of a map that we built of isotope map of feathers from the region, and know that on average they're coming 60, 70, 80 kilometers away. So isotope data are great because they like to say every capture is a recapture, because every time you capture a bird, you learn something about where it was previously. The disadvantages here is that it's relatively low spatial resolution. So there's quite a lot of error in those isotopic maps, and a lot of sort of unexplained variation. So it's not like we can pinpoint exact locations or anything like that. Getting down to finer scales, handheld telemetry. Stick a radio tag on a bird, follow it around with an antenna. It makes this little beep sound. You can triangulate it in on the bird, and you can get these short scale movements. That's one of the ways that we figured out how far our local birds were dispersing within season. That's amazing spatial precision. Again, though, very high amount of labor, and you can't really track them over very long scales. So finally, the last thing is we can scale radio telemetry up to put tags on birds that communicate via satellite. So some of you may have seen some snowy owls in winter this year or previous winters. A lot of what we know about snowy owl movement comes from these satellite tags. So these are little, again, on the back of the bird, you can see an owl up there with a tag on it. It's got a little solar panel on it, and it communicates with satellites. So it gives its position. You can program them to sort of report every day or every week or whatever you want, and it'll send a message like, I'm here, and then you're sitting in your office and you like, oh, there's my owl, which is really lovely. So that's like amazing, right? I kind of wish that we could do that with every bird. The drawbacks, unfortunately, with satellite telemetry is that it's very expensive, and they're also really heavy. And so we can only really do that with big birds. So we got a problem. Got all these amazing, interesting movements going on in Great Plains birds that seems to be a little bit different from some of these birds in other places. A lot of those aren't gigantic scales. and we don't have a lot of tools to answer those questions. So maybe about 10 years ago, enter something called the MODIS network. And this is a network of automated telemetry receivers. So you remember the slide with the handheld, the guy, yeah. So those same antennae are mounted on a structure, on a tower, or on top of a building, something like that. And those receivers receive information from similar to those radio tags, but they're digitally coded, so the same frequency you can get hundreds and hundreds of individuals, all receiving on the same frequency. It logs those records. If the bird flies within about 15 kilometers, 10 miles line of sight of that antenna, it will be picked up by the antenna. That information is stored, also transmitted via the internet. So again, you're sitting in your office, it's like, oh, my bird was like detected in Texas, cool. So sent to a central repository. And one of the most amazing things about the MODIS network is that it's wholly collaborative. So if you sign on to this, you want to be part of the MODIS network, you are contributing to everybody else's project in the network, because your tower will hear everybody else's tags. So any tower added to that network is value added for everybody in the continent, and or beyond. And then by the flip side of that is if anybody wanting to do their own MODIS project with MODIS tags, not only is it the local infrastructure that's going to help them, but this huge network of other receivers in other places. And this has really, really changed a lot about how we understand the movements of little birds, especially in the Northeast. In Pennsylvania is a place where they got a lot of towers and stuff. So this is what it looks like close up. You got a little tag, just very much like a radio. It is a radio tag, okay? Little antenna off the back. This middle picture here is the brand new MODIS tower on the Kanza Prairie. Yeah. So if you're driving down 177 towards I-70, about halfway down, if you look off to the right on a hilltop, you will see that tower. It's visible from the road. For those of you who know Kanza Gates, it's right past Gate 5. And so that's our tower. The picture on the right here is the contents of that box at the bottom of the tower, and that's where information received by the antennas goes into this little Raspberry Pi computer. There's a modem, cell connection. It's all powered by solar power. But if you have like internet, if you have a modem, if you mount it on a building, it's a lot even easier. It doesn't need to have solar power. You can just plug it in. You can attach it to your Wi-Fi, and you're bingo, done. It's an amazing thing. And I was actually a postdoc in Southern Ontario when the whole MODIS idea was being developed. And I remember being really excited, but thinking, never really imagining that I'd be standing here now talking to you guys about MODIS in Kansas. I was a postdoc, and this is a picture of Southern Ontario towers now. It started with maybe about 20 towers along Lake Erie and elsewhere in Southern Ontario. Brainchild of folks at Bird Studies Canada, Long Point Bird Observatory, and the University of Western Ontario, where I was a postdoc. And so now, across North America, it looks like this. Every little yellow dot is a MODIS tower, MODIS receiver, okay? So it's a huge network. It's expanded especially in the Eastern Seaboard, but it's also elsewhere on the West Coast. And then if you zoom out to the world, increasingly we're getting more towers in South America, and that's largely due to efforts of people who study long-distance migrants within North America. And it's being picked up in other parts of the world too. I would predict that in maybe 10 years, large parts of the world will be covered by MODIS. And that is super exciting from the perspective of somebody who wants to know everything there is about bird movement. I'm just going to highlight, though, if we go back to 2017, this has really grown fast. So this was North America towers 5 years ago, okay? You can look at how little coverage there. There's absolutely zero in the middle of the continent, right? There's some on the coast in Texas. 2018, we start to see, there's a couple in Texas starting to fill in. We get more just very sparse in the Midwest, a few up in the Northwest, like in southern British Columbia. That was 2020. Okay, so 2021 is last February. A year ago, this is what it looked like. And if you've been paying attention, you may anticipate that my main point here is that there's still a very big blank area in the middle of the continent, right? We're out here to do something about that. Fortunately, I am not alone. I am just a small cog in a bunch of wheels that are turning to try to make this happen. Currently in Kansas, we have 8 functional receivers, and all of those went out last summer. All of those were paid for and installed by our wonderful collaborators at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And they came out here, they brought their materials, they had local people to work with, and I helped install the one at Kanza, but it was through a grant that they got. And their goal is, like mine, to really expand MODIS within the Great Plains. Their goal is very broad spatially. So they did some in Nebraska, they want to keep going up into South Dakota, North Dakota. They're also putting a bunch down in northern Mexico where some of these really threatened grassland-dependent birds spend the winter. Their approach is broad, and that is really amazing for some of those movements. And I just want to say, like, within maybe a month or something of the tower going up, we detected some birds, and it's already really cool. So this is these are Swainson's. We caught a couple of Swainson's thrush. We didn't catch them. We detected them. Banded in Montana that made a beeline across were detected at 2 of the new towers on the Platte River, and within hours were flying past Kanza. Who would have thought that Swainson's thrushes, instead of just going south, would fly all the way across the Great Plains to migrate south to South America? That's unknown. That's an example of some of the really just cool natural history that we can get out of this. Of course, I'm into for the science as well as the cool natural history. And so my vision is this. I want to see towers, collaborators, co-tagging efforts, education, and engaged citizens around MODIS in Kansas. And this is our current map, and my hope is that in the next sort of several years, we can fill in our personal map with receivers around the state. And I've been chipping away at this. I'm a pretty busy person, as Robert will attest to, but as much as I can, I've been trying to move all the balls uphill to make this happen in various different ways. And I think it's going to require a lot of different organizations contributing in a lot of different ways. So we want to get more towers out there. One of the things I've been working on is with one of my colleagues at Emporia State and one of my colleagues at Pittsburgh State, is for the 3 of us to all be mentoring a master's student who will take advantage of that MODIS network to do research projects that we will all contribute to each other's tagging efforts. So we'll get tagging across the eastern third of the state and help co-train and that sort of thing as well. Hopefully we're try to persuade the Kansas Department of Parks and Wildlife to fund that effort. And that's one of the big balls I've been trying to move up the hill. I also think that MODIS is absolutely incredible opportunity for education. There's something very compelling about knowing where an individual bird is and watching it move across the landscape. And there's already a lot of educational materials around MODIS that we can adapt to our local context, and use in existing programs, maybe additional programs, but I think, go for the low-hanging fruit first. And then I also really think that not just kids, but engagement of the public. This is for the same reasons why kids like it. I think the members of the public are engaged, and I'm all about involving people in that research, having people come out and see the tagging efforts, or explaining to them about the towers and walking them through some of that stuff. So you might be wondering how all this relates to the conservation message that we started this little section in the middle about. And what this is going to enable is a revolution of our understanding of bird movement, their whole annual cycle, that is crucial to making sure that we're conserving them in the right ways, because we can't protect something if we don't know where it is. An example of this might be how prairie chickens use space during the non-breeding season. We know where the leks are and that sort of thing. We don't know that much about the non-breeding space use. And once again, handheld telemetry is really tough, right? So MODIS would be great for that. It would help us figure out how much of this, we see a lot of variation in local abundance, how much of that is due to birds going elsewhere. So these dispersal movements that I've been talking about earlier on. It would also help us just resolve some mysteries about migration. So have any of you noticed that sedge wrens show up in August and start singing on the prairies? Anybody ever notice that? They're not around for the vast majority of spring and summer, but then they'll show up and have territories and almost certainly have nests in August and September. And there's this idea that they breed further north and they come down here and breed. MODIS is going to help us answer that question. Eastern meadowlarks. We know there's some around in the winter, but they're not nearly as common. We don't really know, are the ones that are around in the winter the ones that are here in the summer, and some of them leave and some of them stay, or are all of them moving south? And so we've got the North Dakota meadowlarks right now, but then they're all going to go north. Lots of that kind of stuff that we don't know that MODIS is going to help us find out as well. So how do we make my vision a reality? Force of charisma, but no. First of all, you need to first have big-scale collaborations, right? And we've already got that with MODIS. It's already in place. We just need to plug into it. And that's one of the things that I think is so great, is that we don't just by starting even small scale, we're going to get the advantage of the entire network and all the efforts that other people are doing elsewhere. But closer to home, we definitely need a lot of statewide partnerships to help fund towers, to help fund the research itself, and I think also to help us get the message out. We need to get that message out, because I'm afraid that a lot of Kansans are like the people who get in that car and drive across I-70 and don't see the value in what we have around us. It's not just people from elsewhere who have that perception, but it's our local, lawmakers and neighbors. And evidence that they don't see it as valuable is that we have this ongoing loss of prairie habitat. And sometimes it's things that we like one thing we've been talking about in our family is industrial solar development. Solar is good, right? But don't put it on a pristine prairie. Put it on top of a roof somewhere that's already wrecked, right? But people see emptiness when they see grasslands. And we need to make sure that they understand the crucial role that our prairies play in the global, health of the environment, and how our birds connect us to those other places. Because I'm talking to you guys, I really do see that opportunities for Audubon chapters to become involved. One kind of more major way would be to sponsor a tower. And Jackie Augustine has told me that there are grant programs from the National Audubon that can help local Audubons do projects, and this would be, I think, a wonderful project to take on. It could be smaller scale. It could be sponsoring a bird. You know, tags cost about $200. Towers cost between $6,000 and $10,000 depending on what's already there. Whether there's infrastructure, if there's power, if there's internet, if there's a building that you can put it on. So the most out there ones with all cell connections and solar is 10. And, you know, anything you can do to reduce that, the needs, brings the price down. So it's not going to be cheap, but it's not also like completely out of the question in terms of the price tag. And so I'm hoping to energize as many organizations and individuals as possible to help make this a reality. And I just want to say that I want to finish by saying that it's really going to be crucial for grassland conservation. I mean, this is not a figure, but it is a figure really. It's a diagram of everything that goes on in the life of one of our birds. I mean, this is actually from a grant proposal that I put together, but you know, we're measuring basically all these things. But you'll notice that there's multiple different spatial scales there, there's multiple different kinds of movements, and unless we know what these individuals are doing, we are never going to pull this spaghetti diagram apart, which is what we want to do. So thank you for listening, and
Wow.
I would be happy to answer any questions.
Wow. Wow.
Thank you. Who's got a question? Yes.
What size footprint do you need for a tower?
Okay, quite small. The question is what size footprint. So the towers, that tower, the Kanza one,
Yes.
is like this big around, and it's got guy wires. I would say,
Would it fit in this room?
oh, way smaller.
Okay.
You could fit a couple of them in this room.
Okay, that
Yep.
answers the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're looking on a building, you said?
Yeah, you can have just a pole on top of you know, mount to the side of a building and have it stick up a couple meters above the building. Yeah. You do want it to be in a fairly, like, exposed, you don't want it down in a valley because it's line of sight. So you want something kind of up on a hill so that, to maximize that line of sight area that it covers.
Well, would it be possible to connect it to an existing cell phone tower?
Potentially, but cell phone companies don't like that very much.
Well, maybe they need to be on the list of people who need to be persuaded.
Yes, and Evergy is on my list.
Okay.
Is there anybody in the ether world?
Ask them to ask a question, and they can
Yeah.
put it in the chat.
Anybody listening, and you can put something in the chat, and maybe I can answer it for you. Anything else?
Dave Rintoul is watching.
Hi, Dave.
Oh, we do have one here. Let's see what this one says. If I can get to it. I think that was a text instead of a...
Well, if anybody comes up with any questions later, I'm easy to find on the internet. My email is aboyle@ksu.edu, so very, very intuitive. And I would be happy to follow up with any of you. Yeah, you have a question?
Charlie Riffin has a question.
Okay, hi Charlie.
She said, there's a lot you don't know. What are a couple pressing things you wish you knew?
I want to know where my sparrows go when they don't. So we have these records of birds that we see and we ban in 1 year or whatever, we watch them, and we don't see them in a year, maybe 2 years or something. And we look really, 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 really hard for these birds. I mean, it's possible we've missed them, but I have a small army of undergrads who are really hardworking and good. And we're pretty sure they're not at that site, and I want to know. The isotope data tells me that they go kind of far, and so they might breed in a completely different state. But then sometimes they come back, and like I want to know why they come back and why they go elsewhere. That's what I want to know. And so knowing where they go is a big issue. And so knowing if they're just like maybe across the highway would be something that the tower can tell us, right?
Yeah.
Because even if we don't see them, we're going to be able to have much more confidence in the missing birds with this tower. So if we put a tag on and we absolutely don't record them on site during the breeding season, I'm going to be pretty, that's going to be very strong evidence that they are not there, and hopefully they're picked up somewhere else.
Another question was, can you comment on wind farms?
Can I comment on wind farms? Well, there's many different ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
In general, I think that renewable energy is absolutely critical to the future of the planet. I think we need to be very careful about where they go. And there's a lot of birds that evolved in the context of these Great Plains really don't do well when there's something on the landscape above them. A tree, a power line, a tower of any kind, including a turbine. And so for a number of the species that we're most concerned about, even if they aren't physically damaged in any way by those towers, that they aren't going to hit them or anything like that, just having a tall structure there means they're going to be avoiding that zone. As far as direct mortalities, I think for most of our native avifauna, it's relatively low risk. However, for bats, it's a big deal. So there are a certain group of very poorly understood bats, not the ones that go in big caves and have huge aggregations. These are solitary tree roosting bats that for some reason seem to be attracted to wind turbines and die in greater numbers that we knew existed before they started dying.
Oh,
Yeah.
Another one is, what's the tower detection distance?
It will depend a little bit on the topography. So but if you have it on something fairly, good line of sight, then it kind of goes out in three, like bunny ears, three different, and it's a 15-kilometer.
Wow.
Yeah, so 10 miles or so in each of three directions. So you can imagine that actually covers quite a lot of airspace of a bird moving through.
Good.
So when you're putting the little radio tags on a bird,
Yeah.
are you gluing those to the feathers, or how are you
Mhm.
attaching?
No, you use slightly flexible silicone monofilament. And you make a little backpack. Or actually, it's more like it goes around their hips. But it sits on their backs, and it's got like little loops that you get. Their legs are way close to the middle of their bodies, right? So you get one loop over one leg, and then you kind of put it under its wing and onto the back, and you get the other loop over here, and then you cinch it up. And you don't want it so tight that obviously that it can't do stuff. But with a little bit of practice, it's not hard to do that. So then tie it very tightly, put lots of crazy glue on the knot, because you don't want it to fall off.
2 more questions just came in. What's the smallest bird a tag could go on?
Great.
Would a hummingbird be too small?
Ooh, I don't actually know. So the smaller the bird, the smaller the tag,
Yeah.
and so the less time the battery will last. It's been used a lot on warblers, but I don't know about hummingbirds. It's a good question.
And the other one is, what regulates the distribution of the towers? Is there a...
Project objectives. Because this tower is not like a centrally located, somebody saying, thou shalt put a tower there. It's like individuals and organizations trying to develop this network to meet their own research needs as well, right? And so with Bird Conservancy, the Rockies plan, what they were aiming to do is, you might have noticed the last slide before, when I went through the February 2017, 18, 19, 20, the one before the present, you started to see a bunch of towers in Missouri. And they've got that state tax that actually funds things in Missouri for wildlife, which is great. And one of the things that they've done is installed sort of 3 lines of towers across the state. And so Bird Conservancy aimed to kind of extend those lines into across Kansas and across eastern Colorado. And so roughly a line across of 3 across the northern part, roughly a line across the middle part, and roughly 3 across the southern part. But it's also, they were looking for partnerships, and they were looking for existing structures and people who were interested in having them on their site. And so, Kansas isn't really totally far north, but it counts as one of the northern ones. And then Tallgrass Prairie, there's one there, one near Pittsburgh State, one near El Dorado. It's kind of like, roughly we want to have one in this zone, and who can we find who's interested in letting us put one?
Cool.
Yeah. Wait, sorry.
How do you catch those birds?
Oh, how do we catch the birds? We do run around a lot, but we don't. No, it's not a butterfly net. I should have brought a picture of this, but we have what are called mist nets. We use 12-meter long ones. So what's 12 meters? 30 feet. Okay, and they're about this tall, and they're made out of very fine nylon mesh, and they've got some thicker strands that go across, and so the mesh kind of balloons or bags in between those thicker ones, and you put them up. If you're targeting a specific individual, like we are with grasshopper sparrows, we'll say, okay, we want to catch that bird. That guy doesn't have any bands. We'll go to the middle of his territory. We'll figure out, like, they always have these favorite perches, and there's poop on them and stuff. And we'll put a net right beside it, and then at the bottom, we'll put a little speaker and a little iPod or something, and play his own song back to him. And he thinks, there's an intruder in my territory. I'm going to go get it. And he can see the net. They aren't stupid. They're really, really smart. But eventually the hormones get the better of him, and he hits the net, and we run over and grab him.
Carefully.
But sometimes in the year we're doing more passive netting. We use the same mist nets, but we just put them up, like we do this monitoring in the winter, and those are like fixed locations, and the birds just accidentally fly into them. They don't see them. And it's really fun. Yeah, Robert?
Where would you like the next tower to go?
Ooh, where would I like the next tower? I'd like the next tower to be within about maybe 30 to 50 miles north of here. Or around here. I mean, that's a selfish.
Why?
So, why? Because we don't have anything between us and the Platte River, and I want them for my own. I'm just answering now from a personal research, like pie in the sky. Where would I personally want one next? I want some basically surrounding my core study site. That would be the ideal. But I mean, you don't need a lot to sort of surround it, right? So.
So you can triangulate?
Oh, so I can catch them going off in any direction. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also that I kind of know where the other ones are. There's, more further south in the Flint Hills. Southern Flint Hills would be great. There's a TNC site down in the Southern Flint Hills, and I should say that I've been working with the Nature Conservancy, talking to them about it, and they're really keen to put up more. And so we may get another 3 on Nature Conservancy properties in the next year or so as well.
Great.
Yeah. So I know where some of the ones that are kind of in the offing are maybe going to go. Yeah. I've also, one of my former students now works at Fort Riley, and she's working on them to get one at Fort Riley even, so,
Good.
yeah.
Super. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming out. It's lovely to